So we're going to have a look at how our breath is controlled during exercise. Remember, pulmonary ventilation is just breathing. Pulmonary means to do with the lungs, and ventilation is moving air in and out of the lungs, so breathing. And the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, controls this. And there's two parts to the ANS. We have the sympathetic nervous system. That's preparing our body for exercise, increasing our breathing rate. And the parasympathetic nervous system, that does the opposite. It decreases our breathing rate, and it's getting our body back to that resting state. So, inside the brain, in the medulla oblongata, there is something called the respiratory center. And this is the part of the brain that controls the rate, or the speed, and the depth of our breathing. And to do this, it's controlled by both neural and chemical factors. So there's two parts to the respiratory control center. We have the inspiratory center. That's responsible for inspiration and expiration. And we have the expiratory center. This stimulates those expiratory muscles during exercise. Think back to those accessory muscles in particular. Now, if you remember, there are some receptors in our body. These act like detectives, and they send messages back to the brain, giving the brain information about what's going on in the body so the brain can respond and change things if it needs to. When we're talking about breathing, these receptors send messages back to the respiratory control center in the brain. We've got chemoreceptors. Remember, chemo to do with chemicals. We've got baroreceptors. That's to do with pressure. We've got proprioceptors to do with movement, and stretch receptors to do with stretching. So let's have a look at those. When we exercise, thanks to respiration, our body produces more carbon dioxide. If there's more carbon dioxide in the blood pH will drop. This means the blood is more acidic. Our body can't work so well, so the chemoreceptors detect this. They send a message back to the brain, and the brain says, we need to increase ventilation. We need to breathe more, faster and deeper, so that we can get rid of this carbon dioxide and get in more oxygen. That helps to reduce the blood pH so it's less acidic and the body can continue to work. Then we've got our proprioceptors. These are mechanical factors, so we're thinking about movement. So proprioceptors, they're detecting movement in the joints and the muscles, so they're found there in the joints and the muscles. When they detect this muscle movement, they send a message to the brain, and the brain senses this message in the respiratory center, and again, it sends a message to increase breathing when we're exercising, because it knows that we need more oxygen at those muscles so they can continue working. Next, we have the baroreceptors. Remember, they detect changes in blood pressure. When we exercise, we have a decrease in blood pressure, which is detected by the baroreceptors, and they send that message to the brain, and the brain sends a message back and increases the breathing rate, especially when we're exercising. Finally, we have the stretch receptors. Now, when you're exercising, you think about the way that you're breathing more and deeper, your lungs get stretched more. The stretch receptors are very important to prevent overinflation of the lungs, so we don't damage the lungs. And they do this by sending messages, impulses, to those expiratory muscles, the abdominals, the intercostal muscles. And this encourages expiration to occur. Let's just look at that in a bit more detail. We call this the Herring-Brewer reflex. And basically, it's a feedback mechanism that is helping with regulating breathing, and it's preventing that overinflation. So the stretch receptors send the signals back to the brainstem where the respiratory control centre is in the medulla oblongata, and it adjusts the rate and the depth of breathing. And so basically when the lungs are stretched by a really big deep breath, the stretch receptors send that message back to the brain and they inhibit or they lower that inhalation. And that basically prevents overinflation of the lungs. If the lungs are very deflated and the breathing is too shallow, then the stretch receptors do the opposite. They send a message to the brain stimulates inhalation, and that helps to fill the lungs with the fresh oxygen. So this just helps to maintain that balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide, just like with the other receptors. So imagine we got an exam question on this that was something like, describe how breathing is controlled during exercise. Let's pick out the key points. If we have more carbon dioxide, blood pH will decrease. So this makes the blood more acidic. It's picked up by the chemoreceptors. Muscle movement is detected by the proprioceptors. And both of these things stimulate the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, to increase the depth of breathing. Baroreceptors also inform the ANS that they need to increase the rate of breathing due to that decrease in blood pressure. And so this increase in breathing rate causes the lungs to stretch further, and stretch receptors prevent overinflation of the lungs. And that is a quick summary of how we control our breathing during exercise.